Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very informative show coming right up with special guest Alison Green. And Alison's here today to talk to us about her new book, Ask a Manager: How to Navigate Clueless Colleagues, Lunch-Stealing Bosses, and the Rest of Your Life at Work. Now, Alison runs the Ask a Manager blog, where she answers readers' questions daily on office and management issues. Ask a Manager receives over 2 million visits each month and has been featured in USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, CBS News, ABC News, Fox News, Glamour, and more. So let's welcome to the show, Alison.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, what a pleasure it is to have you here. My goodness, what a great book. I mean, anyone that has, issues with boundaries at work, they need to pick this book up right now.
Thank you. That's great to hear. I think I've written on workplace issues for, more than a decade at this point. But the book is the first time that I've tried to put it into book form. And with the book, I wanted to do something different than I do with my website. So it's good to hear that people are finding it useful.
Well, and why don't we start there? Because I know a lot of times people are so curious. It's like, okay, so how did you even get into the point where you've got this great website, you have this fabulous book? How did you even get started on this journey?
So I was working as the chief of staff for a nonprofit organization, managing the day-to-day. And I kept seeing signs that employees and job seekers would benefit so much from getting more of an understanding of how managers and interviewers think. And I thought there were a lot of career advice sites out there, but I didn't see anyone who was giving advice from the perspective of a manager. Someone who would say, okay, here's what your manager or your interviewer is thinking when you say X, or here's what they mean when they say Y. And I felt like maybe that perspective could be really helpful for you. And so I started a website. I called it Ask a Manager, which is basically an advice column, sort of a Dear Abby for work issues. And really, I figured no one would read it, maybe my mom, and that would be it. I'd do it for a few months, I would get it out of my system, and I figured that would be the end of it. But it turned out I think there's a real hunger out there for help figuring out how to navigate a whole range of workplace issues. And pretty quickly, letters started pouring in, and the site started getting more traffic. And here we are, 11 years later. The site is going strong. I get over 50 letters a day. I think people really want a place where they can get very nuanced advice that's personalized to them. There's a lot of places to go if you want to know, how do I ask for a raise, or how do I write a resume? But there aren't a lot of places you can go for the more nuanced stuff that I deal with on my site. And that's stuff like, my boss is dating my dad. I just got that letter this week. Or my coworker smells, or I'm allergic to her perfume, or I drank too much at the company holiday party and I'm so embarrassed to go back to work. The more specific stuff, I think, is what has really become my bread and butter.
Yeah, I kind of molded it into that. So with all of your experience that you have in this arena, is you kind of just pulled some of the ones that, when you developed this book, you kind of pulled some of the ones that you hear people talk about most often, or the ones that go, gosh, that can be a situation people may not know how to navigate in the workplace?
Yeah, that's right. With 11 years of content on the website at this point, I wanted the book to bring something different. I didn't want it to just be a rehashing of my archives. So I really thought about, what are the big themes that I've seen in the decade of doing this? What are the things that come up for people most often? But also, what are some of the really interesting ones? And I think that's what can make the website, and hopefully the book, so fun, is that, yes, there's a bunch of really practical advice for situations that are really common to find yourself in, but you also get to read about some stranger situations that people find themselves in. The title of the book, Ask a Manager: How to Navigate Clueless Colleagues, Lunch-Stealing Bosses, and the Rest of Your Life at Work. That title, the reference to the lunch-stealing boss, is a real letter that I got from someone whose boss kept stealing her lunch. So there's some situations like that in the book as well, which I think keeps it fun to read.
What are some of your favorite ones that you've dealt with in the past that you see that were kind of a common reoccurrence thing in the workplace?
So the most common really do come down to what the book is all about, which is something is happening at work that's annoying me, and I want to speak up about it and get it to stop, but I don't know what to say, or I know what to say, but I'm just afraid that it's going to cause tension in my relationships. And so that plays out in all kinds of different ways. It can be that your coworker is taking all of his calls on speakerphone and it's driving you crazy. It can be that your boss cancels all of your meetings at the last minute and you can never get any FaceTime with her. It can be that your coworker won't stop chewing gum really loudly. There's a whole range from pretty minor to pretty serious. But the common denominator for all of them is, how do I speak up and have this conversation in a way that isn't going to cause lots of tension and awkwardness? And so often that's the theme in the letters that I get. You know, I used to think, gosh, it feels like people want there to be some sort of magic wand where they can just wave it and they can make this difficult situation go away. But I realize that's not what people are looking for. I don't think people really are looking for some sort of magic potion. I think people are looking for the wording to use, and that's what the book is about, is exactly what do I say in this situation. So those are some of my favorite letters. It's a really broad category, but in that I think it can really help people that once they get wording that they can imagine themselves saying, it doesn't feel really awkward and uncomfortable, they can move forward and deal with their situation. But, you know, the other letters that I would say are my favorites are the weird ones. I periodically get very surprising letters because I think there's just so much weirdness out there in the world and in our workplaces. I had a letter a few years back from someone whose employee was telling her coworkers that speaking of magic, that she was casting magical curses on them, and her coworkers were freaked out. Two of them had ended up getting pretty sick right after this conversation, and so they were actually taking her seriously, and the manager wrote in asking, how on earth do I handle something like this? So that one was fun.
Well, and so what was your feedback for that?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing about that's interesting is that when you pare it down to what's really being asked about there, that is someone who's threatening her coworkers. It's really easy to get distracted about the magical curses element of it because that's so unusual and interesting. But really, this is someone who's making threats against her coworker, and you can come at it from that angle. You know, you can treat it just like any other threat and say, hey, you can't do that here. You need to be able to interact with your coworkers in a manner that's pleasant and professional, and you can't be threatening.
Well, and to kind of follow what your book has at the very title is lunch-stealing bosses. So let's talk about that, because I think a lot of people deal with that, where they're working on a project, they're trying to leave for lunch, and the boss is like, you can't go until you've got all this stuff done. We're on a deadline, or whatever the case is. How would you offer advice on resolving that?
Yeah, if you feel like you're never able to leave at an appropriate time or get a break during the day or be able to eat your lunch, you know, that might happen now and then, and some jobs get busy and sometimes you might just need to deal with that. But if it's happening regularly, that is worth bringing up with your boss and saying, hey, I'm being so overloaded with work and deadlines at this point that I'm not even getting time to eat during the day, and I can't sustain that in the long term. I've got to be able to have a break to unwind during the day and to feed myself. I'm becoming less productive because I'm hungry in the afternoons. Mm-hmm. Can we figure out how to navigate this? And, you know, sometimes people worry, I think, about being confrontational when they're asking for something that is very, very reasonable. And one thing I talk about in the book is that if you have that worry, and frankly, I would like it if people stopped worrying about that, because if you're asking for something reasonable, you shouldn't need to worry about that, but I know that people do. And so one thing that you can do is to frame it sort of as like a collaborative problem-solving endeavor. Here's this problem. Certainly we both agree that this isn't ideal. Can we figure this out together? Can you give me your input on how to make this go differently?
Mm-hmm. Well, and besides the fact that it's totally illegal to do that.
Yeah, well, for some people, yeah, so if you're non-exempt, in most states you do have to have a lunch break. But there are some states that don't require a lunch break, and if you're exempt, meaning you're in a salaried professional, maybe managerial job, in most cases there isn't going to be a requirement for it. So in those cases you can't even fall back on the law. You've got to fall back on just appealing to reason.
Yeah, and having someone work with you that way. And I think you're so right, because a lot of people, most of the time, they don't know how to approach it. They don't know the words to say, but they're looking to establish those boundaries so that they can have just a healthier lifestyle altogether.
Yeah, I think it's hard, too, at work. There's a lot of pressure on you to make sure that you're not causing tension and that you are maintaining good relationships, because with your coworkers, they're going to have a lot of influence over your day-to-day quality of life. You don't want there to be tension. Your job might require that you have good relationships with people in order to be effective at your work, and certainly with your boss. There's a lot of built-in pressure to get along. That person controls your paycheck. So I think it makes it feel more emotionally fraught to people. The stakes are very high if they get it wrong. If they do initiate a tricky conversation and it goes badly, there could be real consequences to that. So it's understandable that people hesitate to do this kind of thing, but what I'm trying to show in the book is you can have all of these conversations and it will probably go okay.
One of the topics you had listed, which I thought was really interesting, and it happens in some occasions. I've never had this happen with me, but I know I've had to share rooms with other coworkers in the past when we were at conferences or what have you, unless I opted for my own room, and sometimes that just wasn't available depending on availability. When you talk about that, and it's like, gosh, I have to share a space with a coworker, and in some cases people are having to share beds on a business trip, and what that, how to approach that to say, hey, this is not okay.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because there are some fields where you would just never be asked to share a hotel room with a coworker on a business trip. And so for people who are in those fields, they're always astonished to hear that it is a thing that happens in some industries. But yeah, depending on your industry and the budget and the availability, you might get asked to share a hotel room with a coworker. And some people are fine with it. I mean, I did that in my 20s, and I was totally fine with it. I don't think I would want to do it now. Some people are fine with it, though, but it raises the potential for all kinds of problems if your coworker or you have a medical condition that you don't particularly feel like exposing to someone else, and if you're sharing space with them overnight, they're going to see signs of it. If you have stomach indigestion, that's not great timing. If you snore, if your coworker snores, it can be pretty messy. There's a lot of good reasons for not wanting to share a hotel room. And even aside from those, a lot of people just want privacy and the ability to be alone and unwind and recharge at the end of the day. And if your coworker is in the room with you, do you feel like you have to be at least a little bit on? And a lot of people find that really undesirable. So I get a lot of questions from people about, is this reasonable that I'm being asked to share a room? And is there any way for me to push back on it? And the answer is it really depends. Some places will let you do it if you really push back. Some places say absolutely not. Some people resolve it by agreeing to pay the difference to get a private room for themselves. But I have had, at least one letter from someone who was asked to share a bed with coworkers on a business trip. It wasn't the original plan, if I'm recalling correctly. The wrong room had been reserved. There were 3 people staying in the room and only 2 beds, and it was a big mess. And she didn't feel empowered to just call down to the hotel desk and say, hey, this isn't going to work. We need to get another room, and to put it on her corporate card. For whatever reason, she didn't feel like that would fly at her office. And so she ended up spending the night sharing a bed with a coworker, which is way too close for comfort. No one should have to do that.
Yeah, that wouldn't work really well. I think most people, it depends on your age, too. I mean, when you're 20, if you don't feel really assertive or you know the right words to say, it could be like how this woman felt, like, gosh, I have no choice. And it's great to have resources like your book, because it helps people understand that, hey, there are choices and there are ways to approach this, that it can be a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, I think you're right about the age and experience thing, that when you're early in your career, if something really strange happens like that, like suddenly you're expected to share a bed with a coworker, first of all, you don't even have enough of a frame of reference to know this is really strange and not something that I need to agree to. And if you do have enough frame of reference to realize that, it's often very hard to figure out what the words are to use to navigate it, and what should your tone be, and just how do you approach that. And I think as a result, I think people in the early part of their career often end up putting up with a lot that they shouldn't put up with because they're just not sure.
They don't know what to do with that. Well, and so what if, and I know, gosh, you've got so many great examples in here, what if you have a supervisor or boss that won't honor something that you negotiated? What are some ways that people can work through that or try to navigate through that situation?
This happens surprisingly often. You get something agreed to in the process of negotiating a job offer, and then you start the job, and suddenly what you thought you had worked out isn't happening. Sometimes it happens in regard to working from home, for example. You're told, oh, it'll be no problem for you to work from home a couple days a week, and then you get there, and suddenly it's, well, we really only like people to work from home occasionally if, they have to wait for a repair person. Sometimes it's about the work itself, that you signed on to have certain responsibilities, and when you get there, that's not happening. There's a whole different range of ways that it can play out, but step number one is always to be forthright about it and to sit down with your boss and flag it, articulate that it is, name what you're seeing and that it is a problem, because people tend to assume that their boss has all the same information they are. If I was told that I can work from home and now I'm being told that I can't, surely my boss sees that discrepancy, and this is an intentional thing. And sometimes that's true, but very often your boss just doesn't remember what was agreed to or didn't realize how much importance you were placing on it, and if you have a conversation about it, sometimes that's all it'll take. Not always. Sometimes it'll take more than that. But that's step one, is to sit down and say, hey, when we were hiring me, we had this conversation about this, and it was really important to me. It hasn't been happening since I got here, and I just wanted to see, is there a way for us to make that happen? And sometimes that will fix it. But let's say it doesn't. Let's say you hear, oh, well, things have changed since then. Sorry, we can't do that anymore. Then at that point, you need to decide, how important is this to you? Is it something that you're willing to use some capital on? Is it potentially something you might even leave the job over? And depending on your answers to those questions, if you decide, yes, this is very important to me, then you'd sit down with your boss and you'd say, hey, we talked about this. I understand that you're saying this is changing. I want to be upfront with you that this was a really important reason why I accepted the offer and why I'm here. And it's really important to me to figure out a way to stick to our initial agreement. Can we talk about how we might do that? Now, you can't force your boss to agree with you. You might go through all of that, and the answer is still, nope, we're just not going to do it. And at that point, you'd need to decide, are you willing to stay under these new conditions, knowing that it isn't what you signed on for? Maybe you're not willing to leave over it, but maybe you are. Either way, at that point, because you'll have gone through the process of having those candid, upfront conversations and doing it in a professional way, you'll now have all the data that you need. You won't be wondering, do I just need to push harder on this? Do I need to say it a different way? You'll know. You'll have had the conversation. You'll know where your boss stands, and you can decide where to go from there.
And how to make all that work. Well, and so you've got some interesting points in here, and most people go, gosh, this isn't, I could imagine someone doing this. And in one of them, you talk about a coworker writing a mean blog about one of the people that wrote to you. And you look at this going, gosh, you think in today's day and age, people know that that's not the thing to do. But if it happens, I love your advice on how to deal with that.
Yeah, this is, sometimes I get letters from people who are just in situations where I just feel so sorry for them. It would just be a terrible situation to be in. This person found out that her coworker was writing a mean blog about her with very snarky comments, talking about things she had told her at work and mocking her. It was really unkind, and she didn't know what to do. I think in that case, you can approach it pretty straightforwardly. You can say, hey, I assume I wasn't supposed to come across this, but I did, and I was really taken aback by it. It seemed awfully unkind. Is there something that you want me to be doing differently? Sometimes that question, even when the other person is the one who's behaving very badly in the situation, sometimes framing it as, is there something you need me to be doing differently, can shame them a little bit and and highlight for them that what they're doing really isn't okay. And it's a way for you to get into the conversation without being very confrontational about it.
And be able to still address it, and hopefully that behavior will change.
Yeah, because now you've called out the fact that you know about it, you've seen it, it's obviously not okay. It's going to be pretty hard, I would think, for that person to continue writing that mean blog now that you've had this conversation. If they do, they're so far beyond anything that anyone would consider reasonable that you can be pretty confident that's not about you at that point, that's about them.
Yeah. And that's great insight, because a lot of times people get really stuck going, well, they're still writing about me, or my boss isn't doing anything about it, and just realizing that that's actually all about that person.
Yeah, I think we, for whatever reason as humans, we all have almost a default reaction of assuming that whatever's going on is about us, and it can be really liberating, I think, to realize most of the time it's actually not about us.
Well, okay, so we got this other topic, and I've experienced this in the past myself in the workplace when I worked in corporate America, having older coworkers trying to parent. I'm sure that happens. You probably get a lot of emails from millennials that are going through kind of the same thing.
Yes, definitely. I hear from a lot of people in their 20s usually, more often women writing in about this, interestingly, who have an older coworker who is sort of parenting them. Make sure that it's raining, make sure you put on your raincoat when you go out, and, oh gosh, is that what you're having for lunch? That doesn't look nutritious. The stuff that you might expect from a parent that you don't really want from a coworker, and it can be pretty undermining to have that going on in your office. I mean, if they're doing it to everyone, that's one thing, but if they're just doing it to you because you're the youngest person on the team, that is very undermining. You want to be taken seriously as a professional at work, and you don't want people to watch you have this reminder to wear your raincoat. But I think it's hard because it typically feels like the person doing it is coming from a place of kindness and concern, and it can feel uncomfortable to say, hey, stop expressing kindness and concern about me. But you do have to address it because you do need to be taken seriously.
Yeah, because everyone's judged by their own merits at work, and so to have someone, mother or parent or whatever the case is, it doesn't make everyone equal, and so that's not. I can understand both sides, but it's not good.
Yeah, and I mean, I understand the impulse. I know that I've had to pull myself back before with younger coworkers from intervening in a way that would be appropriate if I were a big sister, but isn't appropriate for me to do as a colleague. I can understand the impulse, and if the person does it once, it's no big deal. But if it becomes a pattern, you've got to speak up.
Yeah, I mean, if someone has Skittles for lunch, that's their deal.
Yes. But of course, I mean, comments on food could be an entire book unto itself. I get so many letters from people whose coworkers are meddling in their food choice in one way or another, whether it's telling them they're not eating enough, or their lunches aren't nutritious enough, or they're eating too much, which is unbelievable that people comment on that, but they do. Or who make snide comments about how often they're having snacks, or who push cake on them all the time. We're so weird as a culture about food, I think, that it's no surprise that it plays out at work.
Yeah, I understand that. I had somebody many years ago came up to me and said, well, you need to tell so-and-so he needs to eat healthier. And I'm thinking, no, actually I don't.
Yeah,
not my job.
Strange. It's very strange. Some people feel very entitled to comment and opine on what other people are eating. And, if it's happening in the office, you're sort of a captive audience. You're stuck there. You can't get away from it. I mean, if your friend is doing it, you can tell her to cut it out, or you can stop having lunch with her so frequently. But at work, you're stuck with people. Yeah,
you're kind of in that close space. And so with that in mind, you're at work with people. Let's say you have somebody who, maybe they're a constant bully. Maybe they're, always rude. They're picking on you. What's your advice to that person?
I think you can go two different ways with it. One, if you're up for it, is to try to just ignore it. Like we were saying earlier, that behavior is about them, not you. And especially if you look around and notice, oh, they're doing it to everyone, that can make it easier to just let it go. This is about this person. They're not doing themselves any favors in terms of their professional reputation by navigating the workplace that way. And sometimes you can just let it roll off of you. Other times you cannot just let it roll off of you. It's too upsetting, or it's too disruptive, or it's actually causing problems in your work, and you do have to address it. I had really good luck earlier on in my career addressing it with someone. I was working with a guy who was just very rude much of the time, just kind of snarky and condescending and just kind of a jerk to work with, very unpleasant. And finally, at one point, I had had enough of it, and I said, I really like working with you. That wasn't true, but I figured that was a good way into the conversation. I said, I really like working with you, but sometimes your replies to me sound so snippy, and I wasn't sure why. Was there something that I'm doing that is upsetting you? And, he never did it to me again. He did it to other people, but he didn't do it to me again. And I think, to some extent, I think people who behave that way are so used to getting away with it that they're not even always aware of how they're coming across. And sometimes just naming it, calling it out, can jolt them into realizing, oh, I can't be doing that with this person. Other times I think they are well aware of what they're doing, and they're just coasting along, assuming that no one is going to confront them about it. And so when you do, I don't know, maybe they respect that. Maybe it just makes it harder for them to continue it because you've addressed it in a pretty calm, matter-of-fact way. So I think that's one option that people have, is to just say, hey, your tone here sounds very frustrated, or you're being kind of snippy. What's going on? What's going on is an amazing question, actually. You can end almost any difficult conversation with it. It's very open-ended, but it flags that something here is not okay, and it rises to the level of something that is a big enough deal that it needs to be discussed. So, I don't know. I don't think there is any foolproof way that will work 100% of the time with bullies or jerks. But if you are willing to name it and seem sort of surprised and concerned, sometimes that will diffuse it.
Kind of move it. Well, it's interesting because I think these are common things that happen in the workplace, and you're right. I mean, a lot of times if you don't address it, they figure out they can. There's some thought process behind that. And this is a blanket statement for everybody, but some people feel like they can just kind of run ripshod. It's like, oh, I can do whatever I want. And then when someone names it, then it's like, ooh, I have a certain level of respect for this person because they're not going to take my stuff,
Yeah. It's, I think people are often worried, well, if I do say something, will it make it worse? Will the person become meaner to me and more aggressive? Maybe. I mean, that could be the outcome. Most of the time, I don't think that will be the outcome. Some people decide, well, I don't even want a 1% risk that could happen, and that's legitimate if that's your decision. But most of the time, people are avoiding these conversations that will make their life better because of a fear of something that probably won't happen.
I love that you said that, because that is so true. It's like they project this fear that this person's, going to lose their cool and it gets worse, when it really could probably just be, worked out right there.
Yeah, and I mean, really, you can game it out. Let's say that your worst fear does come to fruition. The person loses their cool. They become more of a jerk. I mean, at that point, that's something you can escalate. That's something you can go talk to your manager about and say, hey, this is disruptive. This is getting in the way of me being able to do my job. What do we do about this? And
address it from there. So, I mean, and kind of to follow the same track, what do you feel if you have an employee that has like just a bad attitude? Can you use that comment that you were talking about, just hey, what's up kind of thing, what's going on, to kind of get to the root of what's happening?
Yes. If you are a manager, the question, what's going on, or what happened, those questions are so useful. I think so often managers feel like, okay, something has gone on that I don't like. I have to deliver a stern lecture and really scold this person. And really, so often, that's rarely the right way to approach it. Almost all the time, it should just be a conversation. Sit down and say, hey, I've noticed that you have been pretty rude to your coworkers lately. You've been rolling your eyes in meetings, whatever it is that you've observed that's making you concerned about their attitude. Be specific about it and say, I'm concerned. What's going on? And the reason you want to start there, rather than just launching into a lecture, is you want to hear the other person's perspective. It's actually possible that they will answer that question with something that shifts your perspective. Maybe they're being bullied, or maybe they have something going on in their personal life outside of work that is really tough for them right now, and it's impacting their behavior at work. That doesn't mean that you would say, oh, great, continue on. You can continue on being rude to people. You're not going to say that. But it will shift the way you address it. If you know that the reason the person is so cranky, for example, is that they're having a really serious health scare, you don't want to deliver that person a big lecture. You want to work with them in a compassionate way to say, okay, that makes sense. I understand what's going on. We still can't have you being rude to people. Let's figure out how we can handle this. So you want to get their perspective first so that you know what's going on. And if there isn't anything, if they're just being cranky and rude to people and there's no reason for it that does shift your perspective, it's still a good opening to the conversation. You want the person to feel heard. And really, by having the very act of having that conversation as a manager is creating some accountability with the person. It's sending the message, I notice when you do things like this, it's not okay, and we will end up having to have a mildly unpleasant conversation about it if it continues to happen. So there is some built-in accountability just in the act of sitting them down and saying that.
Okay, so what if we go to the flip side of the spectrum? And I noticed you have this in your book, which I found to be very interesting. But you got somebody that's a little bit overly friendly, like a receptionist that keeps hugging people. What's your advice then?
Yes, the receptionist who keeps hugging people was a real letter that I got. And no one knows how to address that. How do you say be less warm, be less friendly to people? I think you've got to be very straightforward. It's an awkward conversation. There's no way around that. There's no magical way to make it not awkward. You just have to accept that. It's part of the job as a manager. Sometimes you're going to have awkward conversations. And I think you want to explain the context that this person is missing. So in the case of the receptionist who was hugging every visitor to their office, whether they wanted a hug or not, so what's the perspective that person is missing? It's probably that she assumes everyone likes a good hug and hasn't considered that some people are going to feel uncomfortable with that. So you might sit her down and say, hey, I love that you try to make everyone who comes to our office feel welcome. That's great. I don't want you hugging everyone. In that case, I would actually say I don't want you hugging any visitors to our office, because not everyone likes being hugged, and not everyone is going to feel comfortable saying no to a hug, and we don't want to make people coming to our office feel awkward. So please continue working to greet people warmly and making them feel that we're happy to have them here, but just do it without the hug.
Yeah. I think that's such great advice, because you do get people that sometimes are a little bit overly friendly. I mean, I've noticed this sometimes in different workplaces where I've had people say, oh, well, hey, honey, or, how are you doing, darling? And they don't really realize how that, they're coming from a good place, but maybe it's not really the appropriate wording to use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in that case, managers worry, I'm going to make the person feel bad if I address this with them. And so acknowledging their intentions, like with the example I just gave with the hugging, acknowledging they're not trying to harass anyone. They're not being a creep. They're being warm and friendly, and that's lovely in many contexts. So acknowledging their intentions and where they're coming from, and then just explaining why it won't work for your environment.
Go from there. So let's touch on the subject of electronics. When people are at the workplace and they've got their iPhones out or their Androids out, how does a manager handle that? Because I think that would be a huge problem nowadays. I mean, we have so many people that are so attached to their devices.
Yeah, I think you've got to, first and foremost, connect it to the impact on work. So if you have a really high performer who's doing amazing work and getting great results, and sometimes they're on their phone, I'd probably leave that alone unless there is a direct work impact. If clients are seeing them and it's making them look really distracted and disengaged to clients, even though they're producing great work, that's still a concern. There's a perception issue there. So you could address it from that angle. But if it's more that, the person's productivity isn't very high and you feel like they could be getting more done if they weren't on their phone, I would say address it from the work angle first and foremost. Talk to them about what productivity you do want them to have and how their work should look different. And as part of that conversation, you could say, I have noticed that you're on your phone a lot, and that is probably part of the issue here. So can you try putting that aside and see if if that helps with your productivity? But I think you don't want the message to just be sort of the principle of it, like, oh, people shouldn't be on their phone, because that is a recipe for making people feel like their boss cares about the wrong things. If you are someone who's a high performer and you're given some crap about being on your phone for 10 minutes during the day, that's annoying and demoralizing. So the more you can talk about it through the lens of how it impacts the work, the better.
Yeah, to stay focused on the overall picture there, and that makes sense. Well, and so it kind of leads me to my next question. I think I've got time for a couple more here. So our country is going through a huge opioid epidemic, and so we have issues with people in different levels of the workplace, either having problems with drugs or alcohol. When that becomes a notable, something that's noticeable, let's say it's at a holiday party or just an ongoing habit, how, as a manager and supervisor, would someone handle those?
I think there's a few different angles that you might need to address it from. One is you can't do that at work. You can't do it at work events either. That's just 100% not okay. And that might be the only piece of it that you need to address, depending on how you're seeing it play out. But similarly to if someone was drinking too much at a company party, you'd want to address that too and say, this is a work event. Even though it's social in nature, it's a work event. You can't do that here. If it's more than that, if you can tell that someone has a problem, or if you're worried that someone has a problem, at that point, I don't recommend HR for a ton of things. I think most things are better handled by managers, but this is something where I would loop in HR. Because you want to talk to the employee in a way that hopefully is able to connect them with resources. Maybe you have an EAP, which is a employee assistance program, where if you're a big company, you probably have one, where you can refer the person to outside resources for help. But you also need to make sure that you are navigating it legally. If there is an addiction in play, it might be that the Americans with Disabilities Act is also in play, and you want to make sure that you are following the law in how you talk about it. So that's something where I would loop in HR.
Yeah, and be able to work with it that way. Well, it's all fabulous advice. My goodness, how amazing is that? If people want to connect with you and be part of your community, Alison, where would they go?
So my daily advice column is at askamanager.org. I'm on Twitter at askamanager, unsurprisingly. And the new book is Ask a Manager, How to Navigate Clueless Colleagues, Lunch-Stealing Bosses, and the Rest of Your Life at Work. And that you can get on Amazon or anywhere books are sold.
Well, I've got my copy. It's such a great resource. And anyone who's in the workplace or works with others, definitely want to pick up your copy and start developing those great business boundaries. Alison, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Alison. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. Again, if you're looking for information, advice, or just to connect with Alison, you can do that at her website, askamanager.org. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.